At 9:14 on a Tuesday morning, a young man behind the brass rail counter of the largest private trust in the state looked at an old woman in a faded blue coat and decided she did not belong in his building. He said it without saying it. He let his eyes do the work, sliding past her the way you slide past a stain on a carpet you have already decided to replace. He told her the wealth desk was by appointment only. He told her the line for everyday accounts was over, there, by the rope. With the others, he told her, when she did not move, that perhaps she had come to the wrong place. Her name was Eunice Calloway. She was 78 years old, and the soles of her shoes had been re-sewn twice with waxed thread because she did not see the sense in throwing away a thing that still held a foot. In a cloth bag against her hip, she carried a ledger bound in oilcloth, soft at the corners, from 40 years of handling. And in 11 hours before the sun came up on Wednesday, $900 million would leave that institution and never come back. And the young man at the counter would learn that a person can spend their whole life being looked through and still be the one holding the door. We are getting ahead of the morning. Let me take you back to the door. And the cold, and the small sound her shoes made on the marble. Coastal Meridian Trust occupied the bottom 4 floors of a glass tower downtown, the kind of place where the lobby alone could swallow a house. The floor was pale marble veined with grey. The telestation sat behind a low rail of polished brass, and above them hung a chandelier the size of a car, dripping cut crystal that threw small rainbows onto the suits of the men who passed beneath it without ever looking up. Eunice looked up. She always looked up at beautiful things. Her late husband had taught her that a person who stops noticing beauty has agreed to be poor in the only way that matters. She had taken 2 buses to get there. She had left her apartment at 7, in the dark, with a thermos of coffee and a printed letter folded into the ledger. The letter had a date on it, and the date was that day, and that was why she had come. Though the young man behind the counter did not ask about the letter, and would not have believed it if she had shown him. His name tag said Brett. He was perhaps 26, with a good haircut and a tie the colour of a swimming pool, and he had the particular confidence of a man who has been told he is going places by people who have never once been wrong about anything except him. When Eunice reached the front of the everyday line and set her cloth bag on the counter, he glanced at the bag, then at her coat, then at the re-sewn shoes, and something in his face settled into a decision. "Deposits and withdrawals are by the kiosks now," he said, "or I can call someone to walk you through the app." "I don't have a phone for that," Eunice said. "I have a letter." She drew it out, unfolded it once, and laid it flat where he could read it. Brett did not read it. He looked at the masthead long enough to register that it was the bank's own letterhead. Then he slid it back across the brass with 2 fingers, the way you return something you suspect might be sticky. "Ma'am, this is the private trust floor. Wealth management, there's a community branch 4 blocks east that can help you with whatever this is." He said, "Whatever this is, the way another man might say whatever that smell is. Here is what you need to understand about the next 90 seconds, because everything that followed grew out of them." Eunice did not raise her voice. She did not tell him who she was, because she had spent a lifetime learning that the people most eager to be told are the people least able to hear it. She simply asked, in a voice as level as the marble floor, to speak with a manager. And Brett, who had decided what she was the instant she walked in, smiled the small smile of a man doing a favor he resents, and said the manager was very busy and that she would do better to come back another day, or not at all. A woman waiting 2 spots back in line shifted her weight. Her name was Lorraine Pettiford, and she had cleaned the offices on the 4th floor of that tower for 19 years, and she had come in on her break to cash a check. She heard every word. She saw the old woman's hand close once around the strap of the cloth bag, the knuckles going pale, and then release. She saw Eunice nod, slowly, as if confirming something she had long suspected about the world. And she saw the old woman gather her ledger and her letter and her dignity and step out of the line. Lorraine did not know yet what she had witnessed. By the end of the week, she would tell the story at 3 kitchen tables, and each time she would stop at the same place, the place where the old woman's knuckles went white, and then let go, because that was the moment the whole thing turned, though none of them standing in that lobby could have known it. Let me paint the full picture for you, because to understand what Eunice carried out of that building, you have to understand what she carried into it. And that goes back 60 years to a kitchen with a coal stove and a window that faced a brick wall. Eunice was born the youngest of 6 in a row house where the rent came due faster than the wages. Her mother took in laundry. Her father loaded freight at the rail yard until his back gave out, and then he sat by the window and folded paper into small, precise shapes, cranes and boxes and stars, because his hands could not bear to be still. From him, Eunice learned that a thing could be made out of almost nothing if you knew the right folds. She left school at 15 to work, first in a garment shop, then behind the lunch counter of a five and dime, where the manager docked her pay for the coffee she spilled and never for the coffee she poured. She met Solomon Calloway when she was 19 and he drove a delivery truck for a produce wholesaler, and he had a way of counting that frightened the men he worked for, because he could look at a loaded truck and tell you the weight, the value, and the spoilage rate before the tailgate was down. Solomon had a 6th grade education and a mind like a steel trap, and the only thing the world had ever offered a man like him was the chance to make other men rich. So that is what he did. For a while he hauled produce. He counted. He watched the men in the front office turn his arithmetic into their houses. They married in a borrowed suit and a dress. Eunice sewed herself. For a wedding gift, Solomon gave her a bracelet of cheap glass beads, blue and amber, strung on fishing line because he could not afford the wire, and he told her, fastening it onto her wrist with fingers too big for the clasp, that one day he would buy her real ones. She told him she would wear these until the line wore through, and then she would restring them, because the line was not the point. She wore that bracelet for 59 years. She was wearing it the morning Brett looked through her at the counter, blue and amber against the faded blue of her coat, and he did not see it, because he had already decided there was nothing on her worth seeing. Solomon did not stay a truck driver. In 1963 he sat Eunice down at their kitchen table, the one with the coal stove and the brick wall window, and he laid out a plan on the back of a feed store calendar. He had been watching, he said. He had been watching the men he hauled for, watching where their money went and where it didn't, watching which of them paid their drivers a day late and which of them paid a week late, and what that told you about which ones were sinking. And he had noticed something. The men who owned the land the warehouses sat on never seemed to sink. They got paid, no matter who failed. Solomon wanted to own a piece of ground under somebody's feet. He could not get a loan. No bank in that city would lend to a black truck driver, no matter how he could count. So Solomon and Eunice did the only thing left to them. They saved. They saved with a discipline that bordered on the religious, in coffee cans and a hollowed Bible and a passbook account at the one bank that would take their deposits, and Eunice kept the ledger. That was her job in the marriage, and she took to it the way her father had taken to folding paper. Every cent in, every cent out, in a column so neat it looked printed. The oilcloth ledger she carried into Coastal Meridian 60 years later was the 4th in a series, and the first 3 were in a trunk under her bed, and together they held the entire financial history of 2 people the world had decided did not count. It took them 11 years to buy the first lot. A corner parcel in a part of town the city had written off, weeds in a collapsed garage, and a tax lien Solomon paid off in cash. Everyone told him he had thrown his money in a hole. He cleared the weeds himself. He leased the corner to a man who wanted to put up a tyre shop, and the rent from the tyre shop bought the second lot 2 years later, and the second lot bought the third, and Eunice wrote it all down. She wrote down the rents and the repairs and the taxes and the slow, steady miracle of money that, once it stopped flowing out, began to gather and to grow. This is the part the young man at the counter could not have imagined, because nothing in his training had prepared him to imagine it. He had been taught that wealth announces itself, that it wears a watch and drives a German car and speaks first. He had never been taught that the largest fortunes are often the quietest, that real money learns early to go unseen, that the surest way to keep a thing is to make the world believe you do not have it. Solomon learned that lesson in a city that would have taken everything from him the moment it knew there was something to take. So he wore the same 2 coats for 30 years. He drove a truck until he was 60, And he taught his wife to do the same, not out of fear, but out of strategy. Because invisibility in the right hands is a kind of armor. By the time Solomon died, 4 winters before that Tuesday morning, the Callaways owned ground under 9 commercial blocks, 2 strip centers, a parcel beneath a regional distribution hub, and a quiet position in the very tower that housed Coastal Meridian Trust. They held it through a holding company with a forgettable name, layered through a trust, managed at a careful distance, and Eunice had signed every document at the same kitchen table in the same neat hand, the coal stove long since replaced by a small electric one she kept because it warmed her feet. Solomon's last instruction to her was not about the money. He took her hand, the one with the glass bead bracelet, and he told her that the money was only stored-up time. Their time, the hours they had not spent, and that she was to use it to buy back time for people who had none. He told her to watch how she was treated when she had nothing showing, because that, he said, was the only honest test of a person and the only honest test of a place. Then he closed his eyes, and Eunice wrote the date in the ledger, because some things ye record even when your hand is shaking. She did not touch the larger holdings for 3 years. She grieved. She kept the ledger. And then, that spring, a letter came from Coastal Meridian Trust, addressed to the holding company but forwarded to her, informing the entity that the trust was consolidating its private client services and inviting its significant account holders to review their relationship in person. There was a date, there was an open invitation to come into the flagship floor and be received. Eunice read it twice. Then she folded it into the ledger because she had decided to accept the invitation and to accept it exactly as she was, in the blue coat, in the resewn shoes, with the bracelet of glass beads on her wrist the way Solomon had told her to test a place. She came to see how they would treat her when there was nothing showing. Now you know what she carried into that lobby, and you know what Brett at the counter could not see. Let me bring you back to 9:14, to the brass rail and the chandelier and the small sound, her shoes made as she turned to go. She did not go far. She crossed the pale marble to a leather bench near the tall windows where the morning light came in amber and warm against the cold of the stone, and she sat with the cloth bag on her lap and the ledger inside it, and she watched. She watched Brett wave the next customer forward. She watched a man in a charcoal suit step out of a glass elevator and stride across the floor as if the floor had been laid for him alone. She watched the bank do what banks do, which is move money from people who have it to places that will hold it, taking a small toll at every gate. And she waited, because Solomon had also taught her that the second half of patience is knowing the exact moment patience ends. A young woman noticed her first. Her name was Priscilla Okafor, 24, an associate on the private client team, 3 months out of training, and she had been crossing the lobby with a stack of folders when she saw the old woman on the bench and slowed. Something about the stillness of her. Most people in that lobby were in motion or impatient to be. This woman sat like she had grown there. Priscilla almost kept walking. Then she remembered a thing her own grandmother used to say, that you can tell everything about a house by who is left waiting in it, and she changed course. "Ma'am, have you been helped?" Priscilla asked. "I've been spoken to," Eunice said. "That isn't the same thing." Priscilla crouched a little to be at the level of the bench. "Is there something you came in for? I can find the right person." Eunice considered her for a moment the way you consider whether a bridge will hold your weight. Then she opened the cloth bag, drew out the letter, and laid it across the young woman's folders. Priscilla read it. Then she read it again, and the second time her eyes went to the line near the bottom, the account designation, the long string of figures that told a trained reader exactly what kind of relationship the letter described. The colour moved out of her face. "This is," Priscilla started and stopped. "Ma'am, this account, this is I need to get my manager, not the floor manager, the other one. Please, can you wait one moment? Can I get you anything? Water? Coffee? Please don't move." She was already standing, already turning, the folders clutched to her chest, and Eunice almost smiled, because the young woman's panic was the most honest thing that had happened to her in that building all morning. Here is the moment from the beginning of this story. This is the hinge. The girl crossing a marble floor with her arms full of folders, and the dawning understanding that the woman on the bench in the faded coat was not a problem to be redirected, but a power that had been quietly insulted, and that the insult had a name, and the name was on the floor by the brass rail, wearing a tie the colour of a swimming pool. What happened next did not happen fast, and Eunice did not make it happen. She sat. She drank the water. A runner brought her in a paper cup. Though there was crystal in the building, she could have been offered and was not. She watched the private client manager come down, a woman named Denise Pruitt in a grey suit with a lanyard, walking fast and trying not to look like she was walking fast. She watched Denise reach the bench and read the letter and go very still. She watched the manager's eyes flick across the lobby to the brass rail, to Brett, and back, the arithmetic of a career happening behind a professional face. "Mrs. Calloway," Denise said, and the name came out with a care that had been entirely absent from the morning. "I am so sorry. I understand there's been a misunderstanding at the counter. Please, will you come up? We have a room. We can make this right." "There was no misunderstanding," Eunice said, and it was the first hard thing she had said all day, and she said it softly. A young man understood exactly what he saw. He saw an old woman in a cheap coat. He was not wrong about the coat. Denise had no answer for that, because there was no answer for it. And to her small credit, she did not try to manufacture one. She simply stood and waited, and Eunice, after a moment, decided that the waiting was sincere enough to reward. She rose from the bench slower than she would have liked, her hips stiff from the marble and the cold, and she let the manager walk her to the glass elevator, past the brass rail, past Brett, who watched them pass with the beginnings of an expression he could not yet name. Expression of a man who has felt the floor move under him, but has not yet looked down. They put her in a room with a long table and 12 chairs and a window that held the whole city. At each place sat a heavy crystal glass, full of water, beaded with cold. A man in a charcoal suit was already there, the same man she had watched stride across the lobby as if he owned it, and his name was Garrett Maslin, and he was the regional director of the entire private trust, and he had been pulled out of a meeting on 3 minutes' notice with the words, "An account you cannot afford to lose." He stood when she entered. He did not know yet exactly what he was standing for, only that the number Denise had whispered to him in the hall had made standing the only option. What followed was not loud. The niche of stories you might expect would give you a scene of shouting, now of an old woman finally permitted to rage. That is not what happened, and it is not what Eunice wanted. Because rage was a thing she had been denied the luxury of for 78 years, and she was not about to spend it here, on these people in this room. Instead, she sat at the head of the long table in her faded coat she did not remove, and she set the oilcloth ledger on the polished wood in front of her, and she opened it, and she began, very quietly, to read. She read them the history of an account. She read them the date her husband opened a relationship with a predecessor of their bank in 1971, when it was the only institution downtown that would take a deposit from a colored truck driver, and the small interest they paid him then, and how that small bank was bought and bought again and folded at last into Coastal Meridian Trust, so that the institution sitting across from her had inherited not only her husband's money, but his history with it. She read them the parcels. She read them the holding company and the trust and the long, careful architecture Solomon had built, so that no one would ever see the Calloways coming. And she read them, last, the current figure, the consolidated position, the number that had brought a regional director out of a meeting. And as she read it, she watched their faces, because the reading of that number was the closest she would come all day to the rage she had set aside, and she wanted to see it land. $904 million. That was the figure in the ledger, and it matched, to the dollar, the figure on the bank's own screens, because Eunice Calloway had kept her books for 60 years, and she did not make mistakes. Garrett Maslin looked at the number, and then he looked at the old woman who had recited it from a cloth-bound book without a calculator or a screen, and something happened in his face that had not happened in that building all morning. He understood, not the money. He had understood the money the moment Denise whispered it in the hall. What he understood now was the woman and the morning and the bench and the paper cup of water, and the young man at the counter with the swimming pool tie, and the size of the mistake the bank had made before it had finished its first cup of coffee. "Mrs. Calloway," he said, and his voice was careful in a way that careful voices are when they are buying time to think. "I want to apologize, personally, and on behalf of this firm. What happened at our counter this morning was indefensible. I'd like the chance to demonstrate that it does not represent us." "It represents you exactly," Eunice said. "He's been here, what, 2 years? 3. You hired him. You trained him. You taught him who matters by who you make. Wait, he only said out loud what your whole floor was thinking quietly. Do not make him the villain. He's a boy doing what he was shown." The room was silent. Denise looked at the table. Priscilla, who had been allowed to stand against the wall because she had been the one to find the old woman, pressed her lips together and looked at the ceiling because she had been trained on that same floor and she knew exactly how true it was. "What would you like to happen?" Garrett asked, and it was the first honest question anyone at Coastal Meridian had asked her all day. Eunice closed the ledger. She folded her hands on top of it, the glass bead bracelet sliding down her wrist, blue and amber against the dark of the oilcloth, and she told them what she had decided on the leather bench by the window while she drank her paper cup of water. She told them she was moving the money, all of it. Every parcel, every position, the entire $904 million out of Coastal Meridian Trust and into a foundation she had spent the last 3 years building in silence, a foundation that would hold the ground under those 9 commercial blocks and use the rents the way Solomon had told her to use them, to buy back time for people who had none. She had brought the transfer authorizations in the cloth bag, signed and notarized, dated for that day, because she had not come to threaten anyone. She had come to do a thing she had already decided to do, and she had wanted, only wanted, to see how the bank would treat her on the way to doing it. "You could have kept the relationship," she said. "Some of it. The foundation will still need a bank. I came in this morning thinking it might be you. I am old, and I am tired, and it would have been easier to leave it where it sits than to move a mountain at my age. Your young man at the counter saved me the trouble of being sentimental." Garrett Maslin did not beg, because he was a serious man, and he understood that begging would only deepen the insult. He did, though, do the one thing that mattered, the one thing Solomon had told her to watch for in the measure of a place. He did not try to save the account. He tried to save the right thing. He asked her quietly whether the bank might make a gift to the foundation she was describing, not to win her back, he said, but because what she was building was the kind of thing his firm should have been building all along, and had not, because it had been too busy deciding who was allowed past the brass rail. Eunice looked at him for a long moment. Then she said that the foundation would accept the gift and that it would be recorded in the ledger, under his name, and that he should think carefully about what he wanted his name to mean in that book, because she intended to keep it for the rest of her life, and her granddaughter intended to keep it after her. That was the first the room heard of the granddaughter. Her name was Tamar Calloway. She was 29, and she was at that hour sitting in a law school library 4 states away, not yet knowing that her grandmother had walked into a trust company in a faded coat and rearranged the architecture of her own life. Tamar had grown up at the kitchen table with the electric stove, learning the columns, learning the folds, because Eunice had decided early that the ledger would not die with her the way so much hard-won knowledge in their family had died unrecorded, in the bodies of people the world never asked. Tamar knew the parcels. She knew the holding company. She knew that the soft cloth bag her grandmother carried held 9 figures and the entire memory of a marriage. And she would inherit not only the money but the lesson the money was wrapped around, which was the only inheritance that had ever mattered in that family, the lesson that a fortune is just stored up dignity and that you keep both the same way, quietly, completely, and without ever once asking permission. The transfer took the rest of the day. It is a slow thing, moving $900 million full of confirmations and counter-signatures and phone calls between institutions, and Eunice sat through all of it in the room with the long table, and at some point in the afternoon she finally accepted a cup of coffee, and they brought it to her not in a paper cup but in china, and she noticed the difference, and she let them see her notice it. By 6 in the evening, the authorizations were in motion. By the close of the interbank window in the small hours before Wednesday's dawn, the money had crossed, and Coastal Meridian Trust opened the next morning $904 million lighter, an institution that had looked at a fortune in a faded coat and waved it toward the rope line with the others. Brett did not come to work on Wednesday or the day after. He had been sent home Tuesday afternoon, told only that there had been a serious complaint, and he spent 2 days in an apartment he could no longer be sure he could afford, replaying 90 seconds at a brass rail, unable to understand how an old woman with re-sewn shoes had become the worst morning of his career. When he was finally called in, it was not to be fired, because Eunice Calloway, in the room with the long table, had asked them not to fire him. This surprised everyone, and it has surprised people every time the story has been told since. So let me tell you why she did it, because it is the whole of who she was. She told Garrett that firing the young man would teach him only that he had been unlucky, that he had insulted the wrong old woman, and that the lesson of his life would become be careful which poor people you scorn because some of them are secretly rich. That, she said, was the opposite of the lesson. That lesson will only make him better at hiding his contempt. What she wanted, she said, was for him to keep his job and to know every single day that the largest account that branch had ever held had walked out the door because of him, not because he had failed at his work, but because he had failed at the one thing his work was secretly about, which was to look at a human being and see a human being. Let him sit at that counter, she said, and watch the door and understand. That would teach him more than poverty ever could. So Brett kept his job, and he sat at his counter, and every morning he watched the door, and he learned the thing Eunice had wanted him to learn, which was that he could never again be sure, looking at anyone, what they carried, and that the only safe assumption, the only one that protected him, was to treat the woman in the faded coat exactly as he would treat the man in the charcoal suit. He became, over the next 2 years, the most courteous teller in the building, and the change began in shame. And that was as it should be, because shame, honestly carried, is just the early form of a conscience. Lorraine Pettiford, who had cleaned the 4th floor for 19 years and witnessed the whole thing from 2 spots back in the everyday line, heard about the transfer the way the people who clean a building always hear about the things that happen in it, which is to say first, and most accurately. She told it at 3 kitchen tables that week, and at each one she stopped at the same place, the place where the old woman's knuckles went white around the strap of her bag, and then let go because she had understood, standing in that line, that she was watching a woman choose dignity over the satisfaction of a scene. And Lorraine had been choosing the same thing for 19 years on the 4th floor, and she had never once seen it pay off the way it paid off that morning. Some weeks later, a letter came to Lorraine on the foundation's letterhead, signed in a neat hand she did not recognize, offering her a position. Not cleaning, managing. The foundation needed someone who knew how a building worked from the inside, who knew which people got left waiting and which got received, and there was, the letter said, no better qualification than 19 years of being the one who was left waiting. Priscilla Okafor, the young associate who had changed course across the lobby because of a thing her grandmother used to say, was the only person on the private client floor who came out of that Tuesday better than she went in. Garrett Maslin promoted her not as a reward for finding the account, but because she had been the only one in the building who had looked at the woman on the bench and seen a person before she saw a balance. That, Garrett had come to understand, sitting in the room with the long table and the untouched crystal glasses, was the rarest qualification in his entire industry, and he had nearly let it walk past him with a stack of folders. As for the gift, Garrett Maslin made it, and it was recorded in the ledger under his name, and it was not small, and Eunice never told him whether she made the entry in ink or in pencil, and he never asked, and that uncertainty, he suspected, would do him more good over the years than any certainty could. The foundation opened its first office that autumn in a building that sat on ground the Callaways had owned for 30 years, and Eunice came to it most mornings in the faded blue coat, with the bracelet of glass beads on her wrist, and she sat at a plain desk with the current ledger open in front of her, and she received people. That was the word she used. Not met. received. People came to her with the kinds of problems money can quietly solve. A medical bill that had become a lien, a family business one bad season from the auction block, a child with a mind like Solomon's and no door that would open for it, and Eunice listened to each of them with the full attention she had been denied at the brass rail. And then she opened the ledger and she wrote. She kept a single rule for the office, and it was the only rule, and it was carved on the small brass plate that Tamar had made and set on the desk where every visitor could see it. It read in plain letters, "No person waits here." That was all. No person waits here. It meant that no one who came through that door would ever sit on a bench and drink water from a paper cup while the building decided whether they were worth receiving. It meant that the lesson of the brass rail had been turned inside out and made into a doorway. And it meant, though only Eunice and Tamar knew the full weight of it, that a man named Solomon Calloway, who had been made to wait at every counter in a city that did not want his money or his mind, had finally, 4 winters after his death, built a place where the waiting stopped. Tamar finished law school the following spring. She did not go to a firm. She came home to the plain office on the ground the family owned, and she took the chair beside her grandmother's, and she began to learn the part of the work that is not in any ledger, the part that is in the listening. On her first morning, Eunice gave her a gift. It was a bracelet, blue and amber glass beads strung on fishing line, made by Eunice's own hands at the kitchen table over the winter, because the original, after 59 years, had finally worn through, and Eunice had restrung the old beads onto new line for herself and made a second strand for the girl. She fastened it onto Tamar's wrist with fingers stiffer now than Solomon's had ever been, and she did not make a speech about it because the bracelet was the speech, and Tamar understood it. The way she had been raised to understand the things that are never said aloud in a family that learned long ago to keep its treasures where the world could not see them. The story might have ended there, and it would have been enough. There is, however, one more morning I want to give you, because it is the morning that holds all the others. It was a Tuesday again, a year to the day, and Eunice rose in the dark and took 2 buses downtown, the way she had the year before, in the same faded coat with the same cloth bag, though the ledger inside it now recorded a foundation instead of a fortune. She did not go to the foundation office. She went to Coastal Meridian Trust into the lobby with the pale marble and the brass rail and the chandelier the size of a car, and she stood for a moment under the crystal, looking up the way she always looked up at beautiful things. The young man at the counter saw her come in. It was Brett. He was still there, 2 years more courteous, and when he recognized her, his face did a complicated thing, and he came out from behind the brass rail around the end of it into the open marble, where there was no counter between them, and he stood in front of the old woman in the faded coat, and he did the only thing that was left for him to do, which was to look at her fully, and to say that he was sorry. She let him say it. She did not rush him, and she did not make it easy, because some apologies are only worth what they cost, and this one had cost him 2 years of mornings spent watching a door. When he was finished, she nodded, the same slow nod he had taken for surrender a year before, and she understood now had never been surrender at all, but judgment withheld and then delivered. She told him she forgave him, which she did, and she told him she would not be moving her business back, which he had known, and then she told him the thing she had come downtown on 2 buses to tell him, the thing that was the whole reason for the visit. She told him that her husband had stood at counters like his for 50 years in this city, in coats no better than hers, and that not one of the men behind those counters had ever come around the end of the rail to look him in the face. She told him that he, Brett, had just done a thing those men had never done, and that it had taken him 2 years and the loss of the largest account of his life to do it, and that this was the most expensive lesson she had ever seen a young man buy, and the best spent. Then she reached into the cloth bag, and she drew out a small thing folded in paper, and she pressed it into his hand, and she turned, and she walked out into the amber morning light. And she did not look back, because she had said everything there was to say. When Brett opened the paper, he found a single object, light in his palm. It was a paper crane, folded small and precise, blue, made from a square cut from the back of an old feed-store calendar, the creases sharp as if the hand that made them had made 10,000 before it. There was no note. There did not need to be one. He kept it on the ledge above his till where he could see it, and on the mornings when the door opened and someone walked in whose coat was poor and whose shoes were re-sewn and whose worth was not showing, he looked at the small blue crane and he came out from behind the rail. Eunice Calloway lived 4 more years and she received people every morning until the last, and when she died the ledger was current to the day. Because Tamar had kept the books beside her for that whole time and did not intend to ever let them fall behind. The last entry in Eunice's own hand was not a number, it was a date. And beside it, in the neat printed letters she had carried out of a row house with a coal stove 60 years before, 3 words. Solomon, it read. We did. The brass plate is still on the desk. No person waits here. Tamar sits behind it now with a strand of blue and amber beads on her wrist, and she receives people and she keeps the columns straight, and sometimes when the work is done and the office is quiet, she takes down the oldest ledger, the oilcloth one, soft at the corners, and she reads the early pages, the rents and the repairs and the slow gathering of a life. And she thinks about a young man with a swimming pool tie who looked at her grandmother and saw nothing, and about how much that nothing turned out to be worth. You have been waited on by people who did not see you. Most of us have. You have stood at a counter and felt the eyes slide past and decided, because it was easier, that it did not matter, that you would carry it the way you carry the cold. I want to leave you with the thing Eunice knew, the thing she came downtown on 2 buses to teach a young man with her own hands. It is not that the people who look through you will one day be sorry. Some of them never will. It is that what they look through is yours. And it cannot be repossessed, not by the landlord, not by the boss, not by the boy at the brass rail, and that the keeping of it quietly and completely and without permission is the only fortune that has ever truly belonged to anyone. Keep your ledger, keep your beads, and when the door opens and someone walks in whose worth is not showing, come around the end of the rail.